something, I'm having some problem with Zoom not allowing me to download the recordings I make. So for the past 2 weeks, I haven't uploaded a recording of our session, which I know for some people presents something of a problem because I know not everybody does this, but I think several of you at least go back to the recording, which I haven't been able to provide. So one thing is, if anybody wants to record on their own device, I can make it possible for you to do that. So you should let me know now. There's probably a way I can do it for everybody all at once. But I don't right away know how to do that. Does anybody else here want me to give you permission to record? Okay, totally fine. The other thing related to that is I should have thought of this last week. I do have recordings from past semesters. I don't know why I didn't think about it, but it didn't, I mean, one, I don't know if I didn't think about this or I thought about it, then realized it wouldn't quite apply. So I do have recordings of the same lesson from previous semesters, although I actually only have a recording of the self-portrait from the summer session last summer. So because that's actually the first time I assigned a self-portrait. And the reason I didn't just wait till this comes up. The reason I didn't the reason I didn't tell people about it was because I actually the last time I taught this class, I started the self-portrait differently. So I started the self-portrait by making a clear planar analysis like we're looking at here. And whereas this time, since last semester, I thought, and I talked about this last week, I thought that this approach had some flaws. Like, it's actually not always possible to interpret or organic forms like the human head in terms of clear planar structure. So let me go back. So I'll just show you what I mean. What I mean by that is, I'm just gonna play this portrait. So so let's say this, I've shown you this image several times, this Albrecht Dürer image, this beginning understanding that we have of the body conceived of as a planar form. A planar form where we take into consideration as much as we can the underlying structure and develop that into a fully developed, organic, but at the same time structural self-portrait drawing. Okay, so I'm going to pause here. So I think that this kind of planar analysis can be very helpful. The problem with doing this kind of planar analysis is, in reality, a particular human head that you may be looking at isn't easily interpretable as a planar structure like this. You get into certain parts of the head, and you in order to make a planar structure like this, you have to invent things in what you're looking at that aren't really there. And so I decided after the previous semester not to start with this very clearly planar start, and instead start with a drawing that was more organic, where we were paying more attention to the organic elements, but trying to bring in this kind of planar understanding to that start, which I think is actually a better approach. I don't know, I'm a little bit uncertain. I mean, the thing is, we go back again to this. This is, I think that this is a very good drawing. I forget who did this. It's not a famous artist. I found it online. I think this is very useful, and I think probably people can see that the way this artist has, let's say, analyzed the planes of the head, it's very useful because the artist has made a drawing where there's a clear sense of turning through space, right? And using this kind of conceptual analysis of organic form, as we've talked about all throughout the semester, is very helpful in starting to understand how to make a convincing illusion of three-dimensional volume in space. But the fact is, like, I'm very convinced by the way this artist has understood the planar structure of the eyes and the eye socket. So the underhanging plane of the structure around the eye. This makes a lot of sense to me. The way that the planar structure of the eyes and eye socket transition into the side plane of the head. The way the cheekbone, as it's created by a bone called the zygomatic arch. This is all very convincing to me. This plane here is not very convincing to me. This is I guarantee you, this simplified plane here is a kind of invention. And so it gets tricky. This is a conceptual way of thinking about volume, but not always easily applicable to what we're looking at. So I'm always a little bit torn. Related to Jacqueline's question about her self-portrait earlier in the class, before we got started today, and also to something I'm going to be talking about in general, just for a moment, look at the way the artist has structured this nose. So the artist is looking at, I wouldn't be surprised if this was a self-portrait the artist did. The artist is looking at what they're seeing in the mirror. And then they're going to great pains to identify and clearly indicate the volume and space that the nose occupies in this kind of simplified, planar way. So they're not letting themselves get distracted by all of the complex organic details. Instead, they're just asking themselves, how can I communicate to the viewer exactly how far the nose moves forward in space from the front plane of the face? So if we can imagine ourselves like tracing our finger along the front plane of our own face. And then when we get to the nose, our nose moves forward in space, right, up to the bridge. And then it drops back in space again to the front plane, right? And there's an underplane, right? You can put your finger underneath your nose, and when you do that, if you put your finger underneath your nose and you lift your finger up, your finger is meeting the under surface of the nose, right? It's like an inverted shelf. And so advanced drawing, which we're trying to achieve, complex advanced drawing, is going to communicate that clarity of structure and space at the same time that it shows a complexity of organic detail. So we're striving to do all of those things at once. And it's very difficult to do. And just from the self-portraits I've seen people submit so far, most people haven't done that. Totally understandable, not because you've failed as artists or didn't work hard enough. It's very difficult to see. And it takes a long time to figure out exactly how to do it. But we're going to be trying to achieve in the self-portrait both that clarity of space and structure that we can see in this planar analysis, at the same time that we're going to bring into it a sense of organic form. So anyway, that's a very long-winded way of me saying that when I taught this lesson last semester, I started with this more planar analysis than we did last week. And then I continued to develop it. Sorry for my slow connection. I'm not sure why.
The photo I submitted.
I'm sorry.
Clearly in the
okay.
In the
so and then I developed from there. I don't know why it's taking so long. Anyway, I developed from there. Let's see. Okay, so we continued working. Let's see if I can go. So here. Now, anyway, I continue to develop it from that point. So I will upload this drawing. I mean, I will upload this video for anybody who wants to use that as a reference. What was I going to say? That'll be available. You'll just have to slightly adapt in your thinking because it's going to be starting. The development will basically be the same as what I do today, but it will be starting from a slightly different way of approaching the drawing. So, okay, so that will be uploaded. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to, before I get into the demonstration today, I'm going to talk about Mackenzie's drawing for the whole class. So for anyone who wasn't here, I explained it already, but wasn't here. Mackenzie emailed me the start of her drawing yesterday and asked me for any advice. And I didn't get the email in time to respond by email, but I let Mackenzie know that I could talk about her drawing in class and talk about some of the things that could change, because I know for sure that some of the difficulties Mackenzie is finding herself having, other people are going to be having those difficulties too. And I think it'll be helpful for everyone for me to talk about Mackenzie's drawing, and then everyone can take that information and apply it to their own drawing. So I'm going to be doing that, and please watch the demonstration in that spirit. In other words, think about what some of the challenges Mackenzie is facing in her drawing and how that may be the same as you are facing, and how you can take the information and apply it to your drawing. Okay, so what I'm going to do. So I thought the easiest way to do it, I thought about doing it in Photoshop, like making some changes, but I'm not good enough at Photoshop to make that really useful. So I'm going to put a printout of Mackenzie's image, that the mirror image she was working from. And then I'm going to put up Mackenzie's drawing. And again, Mackenzie asking me to do this and then giving me permission to do this for the whole class provides a very useful opportunity to address certain common mistakes that people come upon in doing drawings of the human head and the human body in general. So so the first Mackenzie asked me, and I think the main thing Mackenzie was asking me in her email, or the main problem Mackenzie saw in her drawing, was that she wasn't making a convincing sense of the features being on a plane moving backwards like this, and then the ear moving on a plane moving in a different direction, right? So getting a sense of the roundness of the head, particularly as it relates to the features that she's drawing. So there's one, there are a couple of main problems in the drawing that are not allowing that to happen. So, and I actually think you've corrected some of them, Mackenzie, from your first line drawing you showed me in your first email. Yeah, I think you made some changes to proportions, didn't you, or no?
Yeah, I thought the head was too big. I still see that like my ear is not in the right place now, but the head was way too big, so I changed it a little bit.
Yeah, so one thing, so you just mentioned your ear. So let's look at that first. So one of the things that is not working as well as it could in the drawing is that simple fundamental issue of point-to-point relationships. So if you look at the relationship between the top of the eyebrow and the ear, what is that angle? There's a pronounced angle moving down, right? Where in your drawing, the angle is much closer to flat, right? So that should change. Right, so those angles are off, right? So we're going to look at an angle like that compared to an angle like that. And it may be a little bit, there may be a little bit of a variation because the angles may not be exactly as you are when you're working on the drawing, but still we can see that this angle is much too flat compared to that angle, right? And Jacqueline, you were having that problem too. So if this angle, the ear needs to come down like this, and then your angle from mouth to ear is also off. And that's a very common, people very commonly miss getting those angles accurate. So that's one thing to look at. And then just angles in general. So another problem I see is if we look at the angle on the side, describing the right-hand contour of Mackenzie's face, the angle in the reference and then the angle in the drawing are a little bit off, but where there's really a where you really need to look again at an angle relationship is the angle from this high point right at the cheekbone. Look at the angle up to the high point of the brow ridge here, and then the angle from there to the top angle of the forehead. There's a very pronounced curving backwards in space, where in your drawing, the angle from the cheekbone to the brow ridge is maybe okay, but then your angle up to the point where the head, the forehead curves back and space has to change dramatically. Do you see that? So this.
Yeah, but is that
here-
something that you could just like
yeah.
change at this point in the drawing?
I'm sorry?
Is that, yeah, I completely see what you're talking about, but is that something that like you could just maneuver at this point in the drawing? Like that's why I didn't go further, because I knew there were so many things off.
Yeah, you can change that in the drawing. So you're going to want to erase this. There may be a little bit of a ghost of that charcoal remaining, but that doesn't matter. Sure, you can make these
But
changes.
then doesn't that make like the rest of my face now too thin? Like that's the problem I was having when I would want to
Yes.
change something.
Yeah, so
the
that's a
rest of
really
it.
good point. Absolutely. So you're going to change that, and then that's going to throw off other relationships. But that's a fundamental part of drawing, and people just have to get used to that. You make one change, and then you're going to have to make a series of other changes. But making a drawing work is really about that, is constantly shifting things around. It's a really important aspect of drawing to get used to, is that you should never be precious about anything you draw. Meaning you shouldn't, especially at this stage of a drawing, you should never draw something to the point where you don't want to change it, either because you thought you did such a beautiful job or whatever the reason may be. Making a drawing work is always a process of constantly shifting things around. So that's a really good question. Does it make your overall head too thin? I'm not sure that's true. Like when we change this, I don't see now your forehead being too thin. I think before your forehead was actually a little bit too broad. But nevertheless, there may be some other things you need to change.
Right.
I do. So in the drawing you submitted yesterday, there was much more space between the right-hand contour and your nose. Looks like you changed that. So that's better. But let's look at just looking at proportional relationships. So if we take the corner of Mackenzie's eye and look at how much space there is between that, from that to the right-hand contour, and then compare that space to the space from the eye to the far contour of the head, at a point parallel to the eye, those two distances are about the same. This distance is maybe slightly wider than this one, right? So now I'm going to look at Mackenzie's drawing. Mackenzie's eyes go to right here. And then the distance from Mackenzie's eye to where her hair would be, actually to the right, or to the left of the ear. I think that space, again, I think you made improvements from your first drawing, but that distance and that distance is off. I think that if this is how wide your head is, then your eye needs to come in a little bit. There needs to be a little bit less space between the right-hand contour of the head and the right-hand contour of your head and the edge of your eye. So let me see if I can make changes on your drawing.
Right. I also wanted to ask if it would be beneficial to kind of do what, like, I know you said that we should do it from life and it shouldn't be a picture, but I feel like when there's a picture directly next to the piece, it's so much easier to like measure out all these things. Whereas my head is a completely different size than like what's actually on the paper. So my measurements don't relate the same.
It is much easier to do a drawing from a photo like this, which is why I'm asking people not to do that. Because
Right.
you want to, I mean, I'm obviously doing it using your photo from the reference as a way of explaining things that could change, but you want to get used to doing, to working from life. I mean, when I give this assignment, I might have said this myself. I say, I always can tell when it's done from a photograph. And if you do it from a photograph, I'm going to fail you. So, or you won't get credit for it. I guarantee you I can always tell when it's done from a photograph. I'm not going to be that hardcore about it, but I just want to say, if you really want to learn, if you want to get the most out of this assignment, do it from life. Do it from yourself reflected in a mirror, because that's where you're going to develop your drawing skills most fully. Once you get the ability to do it from life, you'll find it's incredibly easy to do from a photograph. Because a photograph, there's something about a photograph that takes the complexity of seeing the three-dimensional world and transferring that to 2 dimensions. It makes that process much simpler, because you're just transferring 2 dimensions to 2 dimensions, right? You're not transferring something you're not transferring an unlike thing. You're not trying to make something that's 3-dimensional on a 2-dimensional surface. You're just making a 2-dimensional reproduction of something that's already 2-dimensional. And that's much easier. So keep doing it from life. But we sort of have no choice but to work here from the image you're sending us.
Got it.
I'm just whiting out over some of the darks in Mackenzie's drawing. So I think your eyes need to be, there should be more space between the edge of your eyes and the side of your head. And your eyes overall just need to be smaller on the head. You're doing something that's very common, which is you're making the eyes much too big. And it's, again, very, very common to do that, because we invest so much psychological meaning in the eyes. And so we just tend to make them bigger because we perceive them as larger than they are. But you want to really look carefully. How large are your eyes compared to all the proportions on the head? And one way to start doing that is really carefully, or ask yourself, and very carefully, or why am I not being able to phrase this? Be very careful in determining exactly how much space on the overall width of the head your 2 eyes take up. So locate the edge of your eye and ask yourself, how far across the overall width of the head does that fall? In your image, in the reflection you're working from, it falls just barely beyond halfway. And you want to make sure that it's falling just barely beyond halfway. So that's about, it's actually just about exactly halfway. So it actually needs to be a little bit, I need to even take away a little bit more. So your eyes need to be smaller. And that's going to make the eyes themselves smaller, and they should be. You're making your eyes too big. And that's making it appear that the eyes, so you said you were having a problem with the eyes seeming to be on this plane, or the features being on this plane as opposed to that plane. If you make the eyes too big, it's going to seem like everything exists on one flat plane, that the eyes are part of the plane moving this way. So I'm going to adjust the eyes like that. And then that probably means that, so now I'm going to, okay, so now I've decided that the eyes, again, need to be about halfway across the entire width, or a little bit less. Now I'm going to ask myself, what's just about halfway between the halfway mark and the right-hand contour? That's going to help me place the eyes. So in other words, halfway between these 2 points, something like that. So I'm going to do the same thing on my drawing. I'm going to put the halfway point. And then I'm going to look at where the drawing of the eye should fall in relationship to that halfway point. So the eye, on our left, I'm going to block in around there. And before I go on, adjust something. I'm going to shift the position of this drawing so that I'm going to be looking at very carefully at the angle of the features in relationship to all the other angles in the drawing. So I want to adjust Kenzie's drawing so that this angle and this angle match up in what you all are seeing on the screen, so that we have a consistent reference point, if that makes sense. So that's about halfway. So now I'm looking at the halfway mark and then the shape between the halfway mark. I'm just going to block those in. And people are going to think, no, these eyes are just too small. But if you're carefully measuring, then the eyes, in theory, should not be too small. So I'm going to just slightly adjust the placement of the nose. So again, I'm now looking, if this is the halfway point between the corner of the eye and the right-hand edge of the face, that means my nose needs to start closer to the right-hand contour. And here's a really important proportional element to look at. Really carefully look at the shape that's created between the contour of your nose and the right-hand edge of your face, or the edge of your face. That's a really important shape to pay attention to in finding proportions on a head. I'm really disorganized this morning for some reason. I've lost my, give me a second, sorry, I lost my grease pencil. It's probably right here in front of me. Yes, it is. So what I mean by that shape is try to develop the ability to see what are called negative shapes. So this is a negative shape. Like, what is the shape that's created by the relationship between the contour of your nose and the right-hand side of your head? Or in this case, the right-hand side of your head. So if you look in your drawing, that shape is off, right? So I'm going to adjust the drawing so that I bring the nose closer to the right-hand contour. So your nose in the drawing needs to be bigger. And then I'm going to pull in the contour a little bit. So that it is a little bit closer to the contour that we're seeing. And that's also going to be an adjustment to it's going to be an adjustment to the angle of the face. And we talked a few minutes ago about any change you make in one place creates a whole series of changes elsewhere. And that's the case here. So I changed the contour, the angle of the side of the face. And that means I have to change the placement of the neck. Again, that's just something you need to get used to in drawing if you're going to be convincingly making adjustments. So I'm going to, now we have the nose placed. Let's bring in. Feel free to ask any questions if I'm doing anything that doesn't totally make sense for people. So Mackenzie, are you seeing those? Are you seeing the reasoning behind those adjustments I'm making?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So so now I'm going to. Okay. So we have this angle here. I think working a little bit better. I'm now going to think about the overall angle of the eyes compared to the angles I've already established on the head. So I'm going to look at that angle, right? The angle of going from one corner of the eye to the other, and see how that relates to this angle. And then so in Mackenzie's drawing, I think that your angle is rising to the right too much, right? That angle needs to come down. A really important aspect of drawing ahead, getting the angles of the features accurate. So from this corner here, and that corner on the furthest point out on the left on the eyes, that angle needs to come down. So the eye on the right needs to drop down. So the eye on the right, according to this reference, should start around here. It turns this way. And then the size of that eye needs to get considerably smaller compared to the eye that we've already drawn on the left. And now I think that seems like a better angle. So I'm going to keep adjusting. So then that means just carve out a little bit on the contour of the head again. So, and again, this is all things that everybody is going to be needing to do to their own drawings. You know, if not exactly in these places, in general on your drawings. Okay, so before I go any further, before I go any further in developing any of these features, I'm going to place all of the features in relationship to the sizes we've already established. Actually, and before I do that, if we're placing the eyes here, as we have, then let's look at how much space there is between the eyelashes or this black line which is the way we see the eyelashes, right? This black line just above the iris. Is that what the white of the eye is called? Yes. How much space should there be between that line and the bottom of the eyebrow? Should be more space above that. So we're going to raise the eyebrows. And I'm going to look at the angle, the point-to-point angle from the corner of the eye to the corner of the eyebrow. That's going to be up higher. So I'm going to get rid of that. And there's going to be more space. The eyebrows are going to be higher. And now I'm going to go back in to the drawing. And I'm going to start bringing in or drawing elements in a little bit more of a kind of loose structural way. So, and I think you didn't actually do this enough, Mackenzie. Again, and I think this is probably true of everybody. I think when you drew the eyebrows in that first drawing you submitted to me, you drew them too much as sort of just tracing around the shapes of the brows, where I'm not going to look at them that way. I'm going to just sort of block them in as a series of angles and point-to-point relationships. And just like I do with, you know, whether we're drawing the simplest thing or the most complex thing. I'm not totally confident about the placement of the eyebrows, but we can continue to develop that. Okay, so roughly place them there. Okay, so then if this is the placement of the eyes, right, the rough placement of the eyes, and this is the bottom of the chin. And then if this is the top, if this is the hairline, I want to ask myself how well I've placed these elements in relationship to each other based on my reference. So how high should the eyes be between the hairline and the bottom of the chin? So I'm going to go to my reference, and from the bottom of my chin to the line of the eyes should be considerably larger than from the eyes to the hairline. And so let's see how well we've done with that. So from the chin to the eyes and then the eyes to the hairline, that's about, I would say about right. That's about how much, it's about the proportional relationship. So now I'm going to ask myself, if the placement of these points are accurate, where should the bottom of the nose fall between the line of the eyes and the bottom of the chin? So the nose, so the bottom of the nose is roughly halfway between those 2 points, right? So we take that, that. So it's actually a little bit higher than halfway. So actually, I think, Mackenzie, yours is probably about right for the placement of the nose. So it's just a little bit higher than halfway. Maybe a little bit lower, maybe, but it's about right. But we might make a slight adjustment. And then I'm going to ask myself, between the bottom of the nose and the chin, where does the mouth fall? Higher than halfway, right? That's clearly higher than halfway. Halfway would be about here. So the mouth is going to be up there. So your mouth is I think, about accurately pointed. So that's all pretty good. I think the angle of your mouth is going to change slightly. I think yours is rising a bit. And then I'm going to really carefully look at what does the center line do on the head. So the center line from the widow's peak down through the center of the forehead, through the center of this little wedge-like plane on the head called the glabella, down to the philtrum, to the center of the lips, to the center of the chin. It's a really important line to look at when you're drawing a head. So I want to carefully place that line. So that line curves up to the widow's peak. So the widow's peak is going to come about here. Ever so slightly adjust the hairline. Let's look at, now that we have that hairline pulled in there, now what happens to the angle of the jawline, or this is called the angle of the mandible. If we look at Mackenzie, at the reflection in the mirror, the way this line turns, and then we look at our drawing, the angle of the jaw needs to come in, right? So the angle of the jaw should actually be somewhere like, here's it come down like this. Angle of the jaw is going to come in like this. If we look at where the ear should fall compared to the bottom of the nose, the ear should be down here. And let's compare the top of the ear to the top of the eye. So the ear is going to be here, something like this. So the placement of the ear is going to be in quite a different place. And that's a very common, I'm not sure mine is right. Let me just double check this. It's very common to misperceive that where that should go. Now, my ear needs to be higher. Looking really carefully at the angle relationship. I'm not confident of my placement, so I may need to change it. We'll see. And believe me, I get things wildly wrong sometimes. There's a guy who does online critique, something like this, but he'll just take the drawing that somebody sends him, and then he will do all the adjustments with a pad in Photoshop. That's a cool way to do it. I should learn Photoshop. So again, looking at angles, let's look at the angle of the neckline and the angle of the neckline and the reference. I'm going to look at another adjustment I'm seeing now is the angle from the shoulder on our right, the corner between the shoulder and the neck on our right, and the corner between the shoulder and the neck and the reference, that needs to come up. So a lot of the changes in the drawing are seeing, again, what we call point-to-point relationships. Let's put the necklace in there as a way of, that's actually just a helpful angle. So okay, so I'm now going to go back to I'm going to go back to the center line and how that relates to the features. And I realize that I'm doing a lot of work on Mackenzie's drawing, but I'm obviously not going to be able to do work on other people's drawings. But I'm doing this because I just feel like these, Mackenzie was Mackenzie was generous enough to allow me to do this in front of everybody. And I think doing this in front of everybody, my assumption is that, again, everybody else is having some of these same issues. So this is going to help everybody else think about how they can change their own drawings. I'm hoping that this doesn't seem unfair, like I'm giving Mackenzie some help that other people are not getting. But just given the limitations of online teaching, I feel like this is a useful way to show everybody adjustments that can be made to a work in progress, right? I mean, I obviously do that to my own drawing, but I just think that here will be helpful for people to see it on a classmate's drawing. So to help me see the angle of the jaw, I'm going to fully put in the shadow shape, which I'm seeing a little bit differently than Mackenzie put it in her drawing. So the shadow shape's more, comes down more like that. It's going to adjust the jawline. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to the center line. So if I look at the movement of the center line in the reference compared to the movement of the center line in Mackenzie's drawing, the center line, just get right in front of the two drawings. As the center line comes down the face, it needs to move to the left, right, as it comes down to the philtrum, and it continues that movement to the left as the center line tracks over that curving plane of the front of the face, right? So a face, nobody's face is just a flat plane like a cube, right? It has a curve both up and down and side to side. Right, so that center line is sort of walking down that curving front plane and turning, for our purposes, to the left. So you'll notice that Mackenzie has placed the mouth accurately in terms of its height, but inaccurately in terms of its placement from side to side. And so Mackenzie has placed the mouth too far to the right. So the mouth, as it sits on the center line of the head, is further to the left. And that's also a very common mistake, not seeing accurately how the features should be placed, both in terms of their height, but in relationship to that curving center line. You want to be very careful about placing the features in relationship to that curving center line. So before I do any adjustments to the mouth, I want to point out something else that Mackenzie is seeing in a way that I think is less helpful than might be the case. And again, this is another very common mistake with drawing the human figure, and something that's I think will be very valuable for everybody to avoid. So Mackenzie has seen a dark value here. In the setup that Mackenzie's using, the light's coming from the upper left, right? Something like this. So any of the planes that are facing like this are illuminated, and any planes that are turned away from that light source are in shadow, just like the palm of my hand, right? It's illuminated, and then as it turns away, it goes into shadow. So this plane right here on Mackenzie's nose is actually a plane that's facing the light source. So there should be no tone there. Of course, we do see a very, very subtle tone, or our eye picks up the fact that this part of the nose is darker than this point right here. But that's because this point right here is really essentially a highlight. So there's a highlight there, There's a highlight here, and then I'll get rid of my grease pencil. So there's a highlight right here, and right here. So compared to those highlights, we perceive this to be a darker value, but that doesn't mean it should be anything like this dark. Right? That's still a very light value in the overall value structure of what we're looking at. And in fact, the value of the skin here is much darker than the values here, right? And that's because the values on this part of the eye socket, as the eye socket is turning away from the light source, those get considerably, or they get a bit darker. And then all of these values here, all of the values on, again, let's look at that. Think about what we're looking at on the nose. We're looking, and if you touch your nose right there, that's a side plane, right? That plane on the nose is roughly parallel to the side plane of the head here. So that entire area is illuminated. So I'm going to get rid of that halftone, or I'm going to get rid of that tone that Mackenzie's put down. That really should not be there. So you're over interpreting a very subtle shift in value. And that's a shift in value that you would only want to put down as a kind of final as a kind of final, very subtle, the kind of last very subtle values. So let's, and there is a little bit, because we have that smile line, we all have that. There is a slight value there, but smile lines also can often be a slightly different pigment, or the pigmentation can be slightly different. So that's a combination of a little bit, just very barely darker, but also slightly different pigment, like it's a little bit redder there. So that's also something at this stage, I would leave that out, such a subtle value. Let's just for now, block that out. So all right, now, so now I'm going to start. So now with some of those elements removed, I'm going to start bringing in more information on all of the features. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm drawing different features. I'm going to really carefully look at again, going back to point relationships. So if I'm going to place the side of the nose, I'm going to place this wing, the wing around the wing on the side of the nostril. Again, all of those things have names, but they're not commonly studied names in anatomy, and I forget what that is. I'm going to look at the point-to-point relationship. So what's the relationship between the corner of the eye, the angle relationship, the corner of the eye to the wing of the nostril? About something like that. And then I'm going to look at the relationship from the wing of the nostril to the far corner of the mouth. So that's an angle. As we move down, we move to the right. So the far corner of the mouth is going to go somewhere here. And then I'm going to do the same thing, placing the right-hand corner of the mouth. I'm going to look at the angle from nose down to mouth. So that angle is something like this. it's nearly straight, but slightly tilts into the left. So the mouth needs to go somewhere like there. Okay. Then I'll just do some, I'm going to double check some other angles. Angle to the corner of the jaw. I'm going to follow the angle of the jaw up to the anatomy of the ear. So this little bit of cartilage is a continuous line of the line of the ear. That means my hair, I think, needs to come in a little bit. So let me talk now a little bit generally about features, since we're here at this point. I'll just talk about features in general in relationship to what we've already drawn in this drawing. So I want to go back to something I talked about last week about drawing features. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more depth. So just in relationship to what we've drawn so far. So we often think about features as, or when we're given the challenge of drawing features, we often will first think about a simplification of the features that we all carry around with us in our heads. And more or less that iconic simplification is something like this. So eyes are almond shaped. That's really very universal across cultures. Like cultures very commonly simplify eyes into something like that, right? And then we simplify the mouth into some version of this. But obviously, there may be variations, but a simplified mouth is often, something like that. That's a sign that we all carry around with us as mouth, right? Eye, mouth, and then nose, maybe a little bit less of a common symbol. Sorry. But we think of a nose often as, something like this, right? An angle coming down, and then it's a kind of modified L-like form, something like that. And so we have these simplified iconic representations in our head. And so when we're challenged by the difficulty of trying to draw a human head that we're looking at, one of the first things we do is we try to make sense of what we're looking at by applying these simplifications to this kind of complexity. And so we immediately run into problems because we're thinking about very simplified flat representations that both don't conform to the specifics of the individual we're looking at, right? This is merely a generic simplification. It kind of stands in for the average of everybody's eye, everybody who has ever existed, their eye, right? Like if we took everybody's eyes and made an average simplified two-dimensional representation, we might end up with something like that. But when we're looking at a specific person, their eye may have nothing to do with that, right? So eyes vary widely from person to person. So like one thing that's similar about this eye and our model's eye, in this case Mackenzie, is that we clearly can see the eyelid, right? But the fact is you don't always see everybody's eyelid. Like I used to see my eyelids completely. I see much less of my eyelids now than I did 20 years ago. That changes with age. And just individual characteristics may be different from person to person. So we don't always see the proportions of these different elements exactly the same. But much more important than that is how the features relate to that curving plane of the head. So what do I mean by that? So if we're, this is useful for us as a simplified two-dimensional representation of an eye. This is useful for us as a simplified two-dimensional representation of lips. But what happens when we get into the complexity of features in nature or in actuality? So everyone do me a favor, touch your upper lip and then move your finger across your upper lip from side to side. You'll feel that your upper lip is a curving, it curves around in space, sort of like a horseshoe, right? Or we could maybe say that as we move our finger across the upper lip, we're moving it across something like a cylinder, right? That kind of curving plane of the cylinder. And in a way, the way the face curves from side to side is also similar, like a curving plane of a cylinder. The cylinder is a little bit more of a circle, right? Obviously, but it's something like that. So what happens when we see features, not as two-dimensional representations, but features moving around that curving plane? So what happens is, let's take our very simple representation of lips. And let's now put a center line on that lip. So what's going to happen to the lips if we're not looking straight at the lips? And if those lips are not actually on a flat surface, but those lips are actually sitting on something that's a curving plane. So let's take a kind of curved plane, kind of short cylinder, something like that. And then we place the lips, or think about the lips as wrapping around curving structure, right? So the lips are not on a flat plane. They're curving around a plane, something like this. And the reason they're curving around a plane like this is the lips are soft tissue. So in a sense, they don't have any form themselves. And the lips, as part of your layer of skin, the epidermis, the lips are rolling around the underlying structure of the dental arch, right? So that kind of horseshoe-like shape of that part of your skull. The lips are wrapping around that volume. So what happens when we take the lips and we turn that cylinder so that it's turned away from us, as it is in this reference? We're going to see something that differs from this, not only because individual lips typically don't actually look like that, but because we are looking at that on a cylindrical-like form turned away from us. So there's going to be all kinds of distortion that happens to our conventional iconic representation that we need to see if we're going to be making a convincing representation of the lips we're looking at. So now there's that complexity, but there's further complexity. And that further complexity has to do with this. So again, going back to our simplified iconic representation, which always throws us off. This we imagine, just like we imagine the eyes, we imagine them as flat surfaces. But if we think about the lips from the side, what do we usually see? Let's draw a generic side view of a person. Something like that. I have no idea why my generic person came out looking like this kind of guy, but so let's think about the lips as we see them on a person. Like usually the lips are, the profile of the lips have an angle like this. Right, so the upper lip is further forward than the lower lip. And so the lips are falling at an angle like that. And the lips, in addition to that, is actually a kind of complex planar structure. So we have the upward facing plane of the skin above the lips. Then we have the underplane of the top lip. And then we have, again, an upward facing plane of the plane of the lower lip. And then we have the backward moving or the under moving plane above the chin and below the lip there. So we have a complex movement of planes that also comes into play when we're thinking about how to draw the features of the lips as we're seeing them on a specific pose. So in other words, on an actual human being turned in a specific direction in space. So we have to take all of that into consideration. We can't simply ask ourselves, how does this fit there? Like, how can I put that there? That's a very common mistake. We want to look at the specifics and the complexity of the features as we're seeing them in an actual situation. And we want to make it easy for ourselves by superimposing these simplifications. But we can't do that. We have to start trying to figure out how these very complex anatomical forms actually appear to us, given the specifics of the way they are sitting in relationship to us in space. So we're going to try to take into consideration all of this complex, all of these spatial and structural complexity. Just to carry that into the eyes, and I'll do it with the nose too. So what are the eyes? So we could think about the eyes anatomically. Let's think about them anatomically. And I know this is new information for everybody, but I think it's useful to think about the eyes. I hope this isn't gnarly for anybody. Let's think about the eyes. Wait. I know I'm going to be off if I do that. Let's think about the eyes, the structure of the eyes. What are we looking at when we look at the eyes? First of all, we're looking at the ball of the eye, right? So our eye is actually somewhat close to a ball. It's not a perfect sphere, but it's ball-like. And the eyes, the eyeball, sits in the protective structure of the eye socket. So I'm not as much of an anatomist as some people I know, but the bones of the eye socket look something like this. They actually look a little bit like if we think about the eye hole on a skull, it looks a little bit like the shape of one it looks like the shape of sunglasses. So there's the bones of the skeleton. You know, some of my friends who are real anatomists might be laughing at my drawing right now. So we have the bone of the eye socket, and then people probably, you know, from looking at Halloween skeletons will know that there's the nasal bone, right? And then we come down to what I talked about as the dental arch, which is that curving horseshoe-like shape of the bones of the skull underneath the mouth. So this would be this bone here, I'm pretty sure it's called the maxilla. Then we come down to the bone called the mandible. We get this is the mandible. This is the angle of the jaw. So we're seeing that here. And the reason skeletons always look like they're smiling is because of the underlying curve of the dental arch. So the teeth would be in there. I've overstated that a little bit. It's something like this. I'm probably off in some places, but that's a kind of, yeah, I've made this too wide compared to this, but it gives an idea. So I didn't mean to go that far in this, but I think that comes back a little bit further. So, but this is, I think this will be useful for our discussion here, because we want to think about this curving underlying structure that determines the shape of the mouth. The relationship of the two cheekbones establishes the front plane of the head compared to the side plane. It's all established by the way the structure of the skull is set up. So going back, folks, I keep getting a call coming in. I just want to make sure this isn't some kind of emergency. So I'm going to try, let's take a break for a minute, okay? I want to just, I just want to double check that this is not some kind of problem. So let's take our break now. I'll get to the bottom of why someone keeps trying to get in touch with me. And then we'll pick it up after the break. Okay, so let's take our 15-minute break. It's 11:38, so we'll go until 11:53. We'll start again, okay? So actually now looking at this skull, not that this matters too much, but if I'm drawing a skull for you, I might as well be as accurate as possible. I think that the nose or the nasal cavity would be, it's called the nasal cavity, be a little bit lower. I mean, we can actually see that if we look at the reference photo Mackenzie has provided. So this my slightly exaggerated nasal cavity. So what the reason the skeleton only has a cavity like this and not some kind of full construction that we would think of as more relating to a nose. So and people may know this, but if you touch the hard parts of your nose, like the bridge of your nose, that's actually not bone, that's all cartilage. So the bone on a skull ends at the nasal cavity. And then cartilage completes the underlying structure of the nose. So again, I'm not really an anatomist. I mean, I've studied anatomy, but I studied anatomy fairly extensively, but I didn't study it the same way some artists do who become really expert anatomists. But so this cavity here, the actual bone ends, can we still see? It would be about here, and then all of this would be cartilage. So anyway, it's a little, it's a little bit of a side. It's a little bit of a tangent, but it's a tangent that actually does relate to the drawings we're doing if people want to continue developing this approach to drawing the human body. Because as I've said before, if you're interested in really developing, or moving towards a highly developed ability to draw portraits of the human body, it's very, very useful to study artistic anatomy. So anyway, I started this whole thing. I didn't plan on drawing my little skull here, but so I started it in order to just to show the kind of structure of the eye socket, right? So this bone here, this is the bone called the zygomatic arch. And that's what we usually refer to as our cheekbone. I don't know if this phrase is common anymore, but people often used to be complimented for having high cheekbones. So that's the bone we're talking about. And that bone is a bone that really, in a way, sets up the kind of underlying architectural structure of the side plane of the head. So I could lay my pencil along that side plane of the head. And so Mackenzie here has, in her drawing, included a highlight. And that highlight is typically along this upper plane of the zygomatic arch. So that's where we see the zygomatic arch. The highlight on Mackenzie's drawing in the reference photo ends here. Highlight ends here. That highlight is right at that corner of the zygomatic arch. And then at that point, the head turns direction and becomes front plane, right? So here's front plane, here's side plane of the head. There's actually a muscle here that originates along the zygomatic arch and inserts into or along the bottom of the jawbone, something like that. Again, I'm not an anatomist, so my anatomist friends may look at this and see that I got that, off a bit. But that muscle actually picks up and fills out that side plane of the head. So that masseter muscle is right here. And the masseter muscle is a muscle that you use when you're chewing. So when you chew down on food or bite down on something, that muscle contracts so that the fibers of that muscle pull together and pull the jaw up so that the teeth are closed. But for our purposes, that's creating a side plane. And by the way, there's then a muscle here called the rhizoras muscle that goes from the zygomatic arch and inserts into a muscle that wraps around the dental arch and the muscle called the orbicularis oris. And that muscle creates this angle on the jaw, on the front of the face, right? So the angle, the difference between the front of the head and the side of the head is created by the relationship between the zygomatic arch, the masseter muscle here, and the rhizoras muscle, creating the side plane as opposed to that front plane. And studying, again, taking this kind of drawing to an advanced level, studying anatomy is a useful way of starting to really fully understand the underlying structure of the human body. So, okay, so back to the reason I started this discussion half an hour ago is I wanted to talk about the structure of the eye. So the eye is the very vulnerable tissue of the eyeball, right? And because that organ is so important to us, and because it is so vulnerable, it is set into the hard, bony structure of the eye socket to protect it. And so the eye that we see in a portrait is that eyeball set into the planar structure of the eye socket. And then what do we get? Then we get the outer anatomy of the eye. So we get the thin flap of skin of the eyelid wrapping around that fullness of the eyeball. And that thin flap of skin, right? Your eyelids are a little bit like, a belt, right? Like a leather belt. It's a thin, long bit of skin that wraps around the sphere of the eyeball. And so that lid that we always draw, and it's part of our simplified two-dimensional representation, is actually a form, right? It has volume, and it's wrapping around that underlying volume of the eyeball. And then the eye has a lower lid, also a flap of skin. I hope that doesn't sound gross. And that flap of skin is likewise wrapping around the fullness of the eye socket, of the eyeball. And then on the inner part of the eye, that lid terminates at the tear duct. And then we're going to see on the opposite side of the nose, we're going to see the other eye emerge. And let's think about that eye that we're seeing now in three-quarter view. How does that eye appear to us in actuality as opposed to this simplification? So we need to be really careful about what we actually see. We're probably not going to see the far side of that eye, right? Because that eyeball is turned away from us and rolling around this arcing surface of the human head. So just adjust this a little bit so you're not seeing such a distortion. think my placement is a little bit off. In other words, I think that if I'm really doing this right, I think that my nose is gonna, the nasal cavity is gonna be a little bit closer to the eyes. So I want to look really carefully at how, first of all, one eye relates to the other. So I want to be carefully looking to make sure that I'm drawing the two eyes so that they look like two exact, for all intents and purposes, exactly the same shape and structure, just on the opposite sides of the head. And I'm going to really be looking at what do I see of that far eye? That eye is a complex planar structure that is turned away from me. So I'm not going to see all of that. I'm not going to see the far corner of that eye, right? Because that far corner of the eye is turned around away from me in space. So I'm likely probably just going to see the edge of the eyeball. I'm going to see the lids turning around in space like that. Let's bring in the pupil. And then the skin folds over this bony structure. So, and that skin folding around, sorry, my low tech setup. So skin folding around that bony structure is what creates this characteristic planes around the eye socket, right? So the upper, above the lids, the eyes, the eye sockets almost always go into a shadow or a halftone because light is usually coming from above. Then the brows would be along that brow ridge and whatever configuration our individual brows may have. And then, so we can, well, that kind of ruined it. Let me get rid of the eyebrows. And so then we can take that same thinking to what's going to happen to this when we think about it in its planar and structural complexity, and think about it actually rolling around the structure of the skull. So I'm changing that because I think I exaggerated. I may not have. The front of our skull projects out from the front of the face considerably. I think I overdid it a little bit. I don't know, now that I changed it, I think maybe I didn't. So what exactly happens to this as it's rolling around? Rolling around that curving structure of the mandible and the maxilla. So that those two bones that create the lower front of the face and the jaw. So we're going to get, I'm going to place the line of the mouth. The line of the mouth happens just slightly higher than the line of the teeth. So I'm going to think about the line of the mouth, the center line of the mouth, rolling around that front plane. You always want to do that. You always want to think about that mouth as rolling around that curving structure. And then I'm going to place the center line. So the center line is where that characteristic dip on the lips just below the philtrum, right? That little groove above our lips. And then I'm going to think about this complex series of planes that create the lips. So the upper plane above the lips, backward under facing plane of the upper lip, the upward facing plane of the lower lip, and then the planes of the skin below the lip. So there's going to be the planes of the lip that are probably in shadow. And then we get the lower lip projecting out, something like this. And I can probably see very little of the lip on the other side. And then we have the planes underneath the lip. And then we move into the skin that rolls around and creates, what we call the chin as the skin, a thin layer of fat, and some muscle tissue. That doesn't look totally convincing, but enough. So you always want to be drawing your lips, or drawing lips in general, so that they have a sense of moving from the front plane to the point on the lips where they start turning dramatically around that cylinder of the dental arch. And you want to ask yourself, how is this simplified conception of lips being distorted by the fact that it's both rolling around a cylinder-like form and turned away from it? So I'm not going to be seeing that anymore. I'm going to be seeing a shape that is a distortion of that because of the way it's influenced by the underlying structure. So you want to bear, as much as you can, you want to start thinking about the elaborate structure of the features you're looking at and get away as much as possible from these iconic simplifications we all think of as determining what we're actually looking at on the human body. Okay, so so bearing that in mind, going back to Mackenzie's drawing, I'm going to adjust the placement of the lips and the nose. So Mackenzie's lips, which are drifting too far to the right, we need to pull them back along that curving center line. And we want to adjust the drawing a little bit, because Mackenzie was a little bit too much trying to make that fit here, instead of really asking, how is that, that specific structure of my lips being distorted by the fact that I'm looking at them from an angle. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to place the center line. Or place the center of the lips on that center line. And I'm going to just give a rough placement of the center line. And so I have I'm pretty confident about the placement of the angle of the side of the face. So now I want to ask myself, how much space is there between the right-hand contour and the right-hand side of my lips? So there's about that much space. So that's where the far edge of the lips need to go. I'm gonna at the same time simply place the center line. Then I'm going to place the bottom edge of the lower lip. I'm not going to draw the shape of these lips. I'm going to place certain key elements. So the bottom of the lower lip goes around there. And then in relationship to this roughed in center line, I'm going to look at the shape of the upper lip, but I'm going to very carefully notice that I can see most of the left half of this upper lip here, right? Because that part of the lips is facing me. But this half of the lip that's on the far side of the face and turning around in space, I'm seeing that in a very distorted way. So I'm going to notice that what I'm seeing is nothing like, you know, the symmetrical half of the lips. I'm seeing a very distorted shape of that. So I'm seeing something like this. So then now I'm going to look at the nose, and I'm going to do a kind of structural analysis of the nose. So I very much want the nose to be a clearly readable structure projecting out in space. So I'm going to look for that front plane of the nose by putting in the highlights. So the highlights are showing me where the front plane of the nose is. So in effect, these highlights, a series of highlights here and here, or these two highlights, they're carving out for me where that projecting front plane of the nose is. And then I'm going to look at the way the bottom of the nose, the underplane of the nose, starts to go into a subtle shadow. So here underneath plane of Mackenzie's nose drops into shadow. It's subtle, but it's there, and it's going to help me create the convincing volume of that nose. And it's not right now, it's not exactly Mackenzie's nose, but we'll continue to refine it. You know, or if we were to just keep going on this drawing, we would continue to refine that. So I'm going to bring in the light. And I'm gonna use this to start to indicate some of the planar structure on the head. So here, at this stage here, I would, the right hand or the left hand side of Mackenzie's face is pretty much all flooded with light. The upper lip flooded with light. Now I didn't leave quite enough space between the top of Mackenzie's lip and the, so I'm going to adjust the shape of the nose. So now again, just looking at the way the light's falling on this head. And I'm going to be now separating the lights from the shadows. Mackenzie did a pretty good job lighting herself. There's a filler light. The light's generally coming from the upper left. There's some kind of filler light that's creating those lights there. I mean, if I were, some artists would love that kind of filler light. I mean, if I were doing this, I would want to get rid of that light. So it creates a little bit of a confusion in terms of the light and shadow on the forehead. Now, as I'm developing this, certain proportions need to change. Let's see that. The right-hand side, so on Mackenzie's, in her drawing, I mean, or the reference we're looking at, unlike the reference when I was doing my self-portrait, the light's a little bit different in Mackenzie. So we get this cast shadow here. So there's light on most of the philtrum. And then we get a cast shadow on the far side of her nose, but most of the far side of Mackenzie's face is illuminated. And then just as the shadow And then as the face just rolls around in space, it goes into a shadow, but then there's some filler light. I'm not going to go so deeply into this that I deal with all that, but just trying to set up a little bit of the light, and a little bit of a sense of the light and dark. So now that I have the basic structure of Mackenzie's nose in, I'm going to bring in the nostril. And I want to make sure that that nostril stays on the underside of the nose. And so just for a kind of structural clarity, I've simplified the light and dark a little bit on Mackenzie's nose. So the underplane of the nose doesn't as thoroughly go into shadow as I've done it, but that's a kind of sort of inventing into what I'm looking at that I would do in order to clarify the sense of the structure and the space. Now, there is, so you can see here, I think that's actually, I believe that's reflected light. There's a bit of light on the little detail of the nose there, but I wouldn't worry too much about that information, because what I want primarily to do is use the light and shadow information in such a way that it gives me a sense of the volume and space. And I think by simplifying a little bit the shadow underneath the nose, it's going to give me a better sense of the volume of the space. So at this point, you'll notice that because of the way the upper lip is an underplane, that Mackenzie's lip goes into shadow, that her upper lip goes into shadow. And then while the lower lip, because of the pigmentation, looks darker, it is nevertheless illuminated. So I'm going to show the illumination by bringing in the white, again, to set up a sense of the space and the structure. And I'm not worrying right now about indicating the red pigmentation. I'm just building up the light and shadow masses in order to start creating a sense of the volume and the space. So if this is where the eye is, I'm going to emphasize that highlight a little bit to pull out that plane, get rid of some of my structural lines. So I'm going to emphasize that highlight. So, okay, now I'll use, I'm going to stop on this in just a minute, but I will show you how I'd start to bring in some of the details on the eyes, because I'm guessing people are probably wondering that. So we have a very rough placement of the eyes right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to double check, make sure. So what I have here is this line here is the same as the line of the eyelashes. So I'm going to bring in, we'll start indicating the lids. And just like I was doing here, I'm going to draw, as I'm drawing the lids, I'm going to be very careful about the way those lids wrap around the full volume of that underlying eyeball. Right, so those lids are the particular characteristic of those lips, of those lids are determined by the fact that they're rolling around the ball of the eye, right? The sphere of the eyeball. It's a very important aspect, or it's a really important thing to keep in mind when you're drawing the eyes or the features in general. So if we're just sticking with the eyes, as you're drawing all of those details of the eye, the eyelid, any of the details of the eye, you want to be really consciously thinking about how those details are determined by the underlying structure of the ball of the eye and then the protective structure of the bones around the eye. And I'm also going to be very conscious as I'm drawing one eye, I'm drawing the other. I'm looking at them both so that they look like they're essentially the same structure. Each is the same structure as the other, just one is on one side of the head and the other is on the other side. So I'm now going to place the pupil, but before I do that, I'm going to ask myself, where does the right hand edge of the pupil sit between the right hand and the left hand corner of the eye? So the pupil is almost halfway, but not quite. So it's a little bit closer to the left hand side of the eye than the right. And I'll put in a little bit of white to indicate the lights of the eye. Don't need much, a little bit right now. So I think that Mackenzie's eyebrows arch a little bit more. shape of the nose is a little bit off. Let's try to change that. Maybe a little better, I don't know.
So, Professor, I think a lot of what was throwing me off when I was doing it also was like I was getting frustrated with the fact that it doesn't look like me. Like that's the whole assignment. Like that very much looks like a person clearly, but I guess because I know my face so well, like
Well,
that's
I
what was
mean,
throwing me off.
it doesn't, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter if these look like you. And, you know, like a portrait looking like the person, that's a very common, you know, it's kind of a, not to sound obnoxious, but it's a little bit of an amateur's sign of a good portrait. Do you know what I mean? Like when you go with people who know nothing about art, again, not to sound obnoxious, and you go, let's say you go to an art show, what do they think are the best portraits? The ones that look like photographs or the ones that look exactly like the person? I don't really care if your portraits look like you. What I care is that you get a clear sense of volume, structure, and space, and a believable organic representation of a human being. Making it look that's a particular skill, and you know, some people are much better at that than others. That has to do with like getting the shapes exactly right, and or getting the key shapes right in relationship to each other. But I'll just say to everybody, don't worry about that too much. And there are famous painters from throughout history who were bad at likenesses. There's a famous painter named Joshua Reynolds who apparently couldn't get a likeness. So he it was very hard for him to get a likeness. So he apparently, at least this is the story you hear. He had a closet full of rejected portrait commissions because the client would reject them because it didn't look enough like that. You know, I'm not saying don't try to do that. You know, that's a good thing to try to do, but it's not that important. I mean, as long as people get, that's not what I consider to be one of the qualities I hope people get. I want people to get a sense of space, structure, you know, accurate proportions, volume, and you know, pretty much if you do that, then everything else is going to follow, including likeness. So anyway, I'm gonna, you know, I went much further on this than I was expecting to. I'm gonna leave this here. What time do we have? 12:40. This is
Well,
what
I was about to say I have to go, but I'll finish watching the recording. But thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. It helped me a lot.
Okay, sure. And I hope it, like, I thought this would, again, I thought this would be useful for everybody in terms of addressing certain aspects of dealing with the features, dealing with the you know, how to think about the structure. Well, let's go backwards. How to think about proportions as you're doing a portrait, how to think about, you know, getting the shapes and the angles accurate, and thinking about the structure of the features and the head. You know, again, I'm aware that you all don't have a lot of training in the structure of the human body, and certainly not in anatomy, or I'm assuming that. I would like people to try as much as possible to see if they can start to bring into your drawings an approach where you start to consider not just the kind of simple observation of the kind of simplified shapes of a head, but instead start trying to tease out or see and understand and draw the structure of the head and the structure of the features. So that's something I'd like people to try to start thinking about. So we have 12:40. Okay, what I'll do is we'll continue today. I'm gonna take down these. This part is finished. But I'll get started on my self-portrait. I won't get it finished, but I will upload the video from last summer that will give you information about how to continue developing your self-portraits. I showed this to my son and he said I made myself look old. I don't think that's true. So if I'm doing, so can you just, I just want to confirm. Gotta get this set up right. Let's see. So if I'm working on my portrait, can you see me in the mirror? Do you all see me in the mirror here?
Yes, we can.
Just want to make sure this is. This could be better. Or am I partially blocked by the, I'm blocked, aren't I, by this? Does that work?
Yeah, this is good.
A little awkward, but. Okay, so what I'm going to do with this right now is I'm going to give a little bit more unity to the lights and the shadows. So that would be my next step in this process. So I'm just going to go, since my since the left-hand side of my head is flooded with light, I'm going to go in and lay in a more unified light masses. And so I'm laying this in over the drawing I did last week. And the drawing I did last week is still visible underneath. So it's not obliterating anything. It's just sort of, what's the right word? Enhancing, not quite, but it's more strongly stating the light and dark masses. And so remember what we talked about in the revisions we did to Mackenzie's portrait. We talked about not overstating you don't want to overstate the halftones, right? So just like in Mackenzie's portrait, there's I can clearly see a highlight here. And then I see a series of highlights at certain points on the structure. And that makes the area between the highlights almost appear to have a dark tone on it. But it really doesn't have a dark tone. It's just darker than the highlights. So you really want to make sure that you're very careful not to misinterpret areas between highlights as darks, even as dark halftones. Because often that's just going to remain center light. So I'm still not dealing with details on the features. I'm just laying in big light and dark masses. So I'm going to start indicating some of the details on the features, just to give people a sense of how I would do that. And so again, it's exactly what we were doing in the previous drawing. So I'm going to be looking very carefully at how sorry, sort of lost my train of thought there. Just clarifying that nose a little bit. I don't know if I've changed position since last week, but I feel like the edge of my face needs to come in. So, okay. Now I have the big light and darks and an indication of the planar structure, the big shapes of the eyes. So now I'm just going to start bringing in some of the smaller details using exactly the same approach I was using in the revision of Mackenzie's drawing. So I'm looking at the shape and the angle of the eyelids. And my eyelids are relatively narrow, or what can be seen of them. I'm gonna very carefully place the inner corner of my eye, looking at how much space there is between the contour of my nose and the inner shape of my eye, or the inner corner of my eye. So the far I see in a considerably distorted way, meaning I'm not seeing much, I'm seeing very little of that kind of simplified iconic shape we think of as representing eyes. So my upper lid is in shadow, and the lower lid starts to pick up some light. Okay, since we went so late on the other drawing, I think what I'm going to do is I'm not going to continue on this much because, first of all, I feel a little bit white after doing that other demo. So I feel like I'm a little bit just a little bit spent from doing that other demo. But the previous self-portrait demonstration I did from my summer session class, from this point forward, is basically covering the same information. And it's it's a slightly different, you know, I saw myself just slightly differently last summer, so the portrait obviously is not exactly the same. But you can certainly watch that demo, or you know, scroll forward in that demo to this point, and watch me continue on that and get all the technical information you need. I just don't think it's going to be useful for me to rush this or try to rush this to get as much information in. And by doing that, not provide information in as useful a way as possible. I think it'd be better for you to look at the demo as I continue it on, again, from the summer session. What I'll do is I'll send an email so that you can have access to that before I get a chance to upload it on Blackboard this weekend. I'll send that as an email, an email link, so you can go right to YouTube to watch it. So as you can see, I'm now at this point starting to develop a little bit the complexity of modeling in the lights. So building up over what we call the center light, that main light source on the head, and building up the lights so that we're starting to see highlight and center light as a way of building the form. So again, these highlights, what the highlights are doing are showing us the points on the form where there's a change in direction from front to side or side to top. And I'm doing this before I get into too much more information on the features, but again, that's all covered in that other video. So what you will do for next week is just continue to develop your self-portraits and bring them up to as finished a level as you're capable of. So does anyone have any questions about anything? So I'll end the session for today if nobody has any questions. Can I answer any questions about anything from anybody?
No, you helped a lot. Thank you.
Okay, so I will. Okay, so Yejin, you asked me yeah, I would recommend holding your head in this position. This is what we call 3/4 position, or what the same position Mackenzie was holding her head in. I recommend that because I just think it's easier. I think to actually draw yourself straight on is much harder. It's certainly much harder to make a drawing where you have a convincing sense of volume. So I would recommend holding your head in this position. Yeah, Jen, I got your email about the reference photo. That's totally fine, no problem. Any other questions? Okay, then I will. So actually, now that I think of it, this is actually our last class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you until the last day of grading to finish this assignment. Okay, so this is not due next Friday. This will be due. I'm going to give you a rough. Actually, I'll tell you exactly when it'll be due. pull up my Queens College email. Sorry, my email's loading slowly. Just waiting for my emails to load. Okay. Okay, so I have to submit grades by Tuesday, December 28th. So I'm going to give people until, is that right? That sounds long. Fall 20 grade rosters open on the 14th, fall 2021 grade submission deadline for graduate and undergraduate courses. Okay, so I'm going to give people until, I'm not going to give you until the 28th. But I will give people until, today's the 10th, 24th. Yeah, I'm going to give people until the 24th to submit this drawing. Okay, so the final completed self-portrait will be due on Friday the 24th. That will be reflected in the assignment as it's posted on Blackboard this weekend. If anyone wants to get in touch with me and has questions about the development of the portrait in between now and then, that's fine. So any questions about any of that?
I'm gonna assume that we won't have a final critique like we've had like the other two.
No, we're not, because I just wanted to get in. I'm not going to have like an official full class of final critiques. If you'd like to speak to me, just email me, and that goes for everybody. You can certainly email me and we can set up a time to talk about the work you've done, but I'm not going to have a set aside period of time, but you're welcome to email me to do that. Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. All right. So let me know between now and the due date if anybody needs any input. Okay. And otherwise, have a great end of the semester and have great holidays to everybody.